Nicole, are you saying that we learn more about collective bargaining with private sector unions than we do with public, which is, bass backwards?
We don't, but we don't really need to know anything about private sector bargaining. I mean, it's between two private parties. So if you're, assuming there's no federal bailout of the company involved, it's an auto company and the union, and they both have an incentive to keep the company in business and not to push prices so high that the customer won't buy the
Whereas
product.
in the
So it's
public
kind of
sector,
like,
it's
yeah, it's
it's two wolves and a sheep negotiating what's for dinner, with the sheep being the taxpayer.
Welcome back to the City Journal podcast. I'm your host, Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and senior editor of City Journal. Joining me on the panel today are Ilya Shapiro, a constitutional law guy at the Manhattan Institute, John Ketcham, other law guy at the Manhattan Institute, and our guest, Nicole Gelinas, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, columnist, the New York Times opinion contributing writer, and author of Movement, a history of New York City's fight to reclaim its streets from the car, which I was told just before this call just won the Gotham Book Prize. So congratulations, Nicole.
Thank you, Charles.
We're very happy to have you. I'm gonna
Are we
jump.
plugging our books? Because I can plug Lawless. It didn't win any prize yet, but here
Ilya
we go.
Ilya is the most aggressive book plugger I have ever seen. I once watched Ilya walk right up to Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, and be like, "Would you like a copy of my book?" It was impressive. Listeners should also buy Ilya's book, Lawless, on sale all sorts of places. I want to now take us into the news. Over the weekend, New Jersey transit workers reached a deal to end a multi-day strike that saw transit in the Garden State shut down and tens of thousands of travelers unable to get into and out of New York City. This is obviously sort of a New York City focused story, which is natural for the City Journal podcast, but it's also a story about transit and a story about the often malign influence of public sector unions. John, Nicole, you're our transit experts. What can you tell us about what went on, what we should take away from this story?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if we haven't been taken for a ride, that this wasn't all just a
As it were.
setup, or not taken for a ride, because they announced a strike. The Locomotive Engineers Brotherhood announced a strike. Go out Friday morning at midnight. Friday is not a big commute to work day. They have these high stakes negotiations all weekend, and lo and behold, they come up with this contract in time for people to get fully back to work tomorrow on Tuesday. So, what was the point of all this? It's not really clear. And we don't actually know what the terms of the agreement are, which is a problem with public sector labor negotiations. The public doesn't really know anything except for what one or both parties want to selectively leak, which can be accurate and can be inaccurate and are generally self-serving. We won't know the details of the agreement until it's too late. So what was the union allegedly asking for? They wanted parity with New York locomotive engineer pay at the Long Island Railroad and Metro North and Westchester. That would be absurd because it's ridiculous work rules that push up overtime, that push up pay at the Long Island Railroad. There would be no reason why any rational organization would want to emulate that. And New Jersey Transit Management says that's not what they got. They're ensuring everybody that this isn't going to cost the riders or the taxpayers anymore. And that's through some kind of reforms of work rules to go along with the higher pay. That doesn't make tremendous sense, and we just kind of have to take their word for it for the moment.
Nicole, are you saying that we learn more about collective bargaining with private sector unions than we do with public, which is, bass backwards?
We don't, but we don't really need to know anything about private sector bargaining. I mean, it's between two private parties. So if you're, assuming there's no federal bailout of the company involved, It's an auto company and the union, and they both have an incentive to keep the company in business and not to push prices so high that the customer won't buy
Yeah,
the
whereas
product.
in the
So it's
public
kind of
sector,
like,
it's
yeah, it's
it's two wolves and a sheep negotiating what's for dinner, with the sheep
right.
being the
It's nobody's
taxpayer.
business. And in the public sector, they can take the public hostage. I mean, the entire point of the railroad strike is to make life so miserable for so many people that the state ends up capitulating, which we've seen over and over and over. Either the state, usually New York, caving to avoid a strike. That's why we've never gotten any reforms of Long Island Railroad work rules, because there was a long strike in 1994. The first Governor Cuomo stepped in and said, "We surrender. We're going to stop asking for these changes." And then 20 years later, his son, the other Governor Cuomo, just gave up entirely on asking for work rule changes to avoid a strike. So just the idea that you can inconvenience people trying to get to work, it kind of gives the union an unfair advantage
Well,
to start
I
out
hope
with
this
here.
goes better for y'all than what we have in the DC area with WMATA, as it's called, and fires on trains. And the solution to declining ridership and therefore less revenue is to, of course, increase prices. Very effective.
This is the I mean, this is part of why I thought the story was interesting, is the the public being held hostage angle, right? It's like, and this got massive coverage in the local press, but of course the local press is the New York Times, the New York Post, where there were thousands of people who were unsure how they were going to get home on Friday because of the transit strike. But that's like, the obvious, as Nicole's alluding to, that's the obvious point of leverage, is like, you can take advantage of the fact that people are so dependent on this public infrastructure. This is part of why, and John, you were telling me about this. This is part of why you public sector unions allegedly can't strike in New York State. They can in New Jersey, and it's sort of fraught question.
Well, they still do in New York, as Nicole just said. So we have the Taylor Law in New York City, which was passed in '67, which basically allowed for public sector collective bargaining in exchange for banning public sector strikes. But we've had two MTA strikes since the Taylor Law was enacted in 1980 and then in 2005.
And the prison guard union just went on strike,
Yeah, so
which
I
is
mean,
crazy.
public workers are going to strike when the circumstances suit striking, if that means that the leverage will get them what they want. In this case, we have 450 workers potentially holding up 100,000 commuters, right? Now, the Brotherhood hasn't struck a deal with New Jersey Transit for 5 years, but that's partially by design. They were a holdout. All of the other unions struck deals. And so now you have a situation where you have a holdout that got a better deal and is therefore rewarded for that strategy. And the problem, in a game theoretical sense, is that you're just going to have more of that in the future, which is just going to raise wages and therefore costs to the public.
Yeah, and Charles just brought up the prison guards. I mean, that was state, but you remind me of something, which is we're going to get a Rikers Island receiver. This person is appointed by a federal judge after this decade-long process,
Rikers,
theoretically
Rikers being
can.
the New York City jail, just for listeners who don't know.
Right, yes. This receiver theoretically can open up these collective bargaining agreements, which result in, unlimited sick time, terrible work practices, and so forth. But the union could threaten to strike. I mean, that would be very interesting to see how the city and state government respond to that. Do they effectively back down and say the receiver can't do anything here because we just can't have a Rikers Island strike? Or does the governor try to come in with the National Guard or some other way of dealing with this? Because if not, you just have the union running the place.
I wonder if Trump would get involved there, because he kept talking about reopening Alcatraz. Well, we have an Alcatraz light in Rikers, and in his backyard where he grew up. Whether he'll take a personal interest.
I mean, it's in some senses that's the argument for receivership for Rikers, which I think is connected to the transit story. Stick on it for a second. Is that so? What's happened is there's a suit that's being brought against the city. They're in federal court, And in some senses, the feds have a lot of power to end run state and local collective bargaining agreements that the state and local governments do not have the power to end run. And so this is, one of the few ways around the kind of bottleneck that John was referring to is that the federal government can get involved, but that just creates like new layers of complexity and insanity. Um, this gets again, John's point I thought was very evocative. It's like 450 people can stop 100,000 people from traveling. I think a lot about there's been this discourse on the left about abundance and we need to have government doing more and creating more. But the major issues is the government is not providing enough physical services, including transit. It's like that's often because when you put these functions in the public sector, there are easily available veto points that exist by virtue of the exercise of coercive authority that don't exist in the private sector.
Absolutely. And you raise abundance. Well, as Nicole mentioned, the circumstances are very different between MTA workers and New Jersey transit workers, right? MTA workers live in New York City and the downstate suburban areas have much higher housing costs too, right? They're compensated more to account for those higher costs of living. But now you have New Jersey transit workers trying to get a deal based on a higher cost of living area, which really sets a worrying trend of having one deal set the pattern not only for similar deals in the state, but also intrastate as well. And that, again, is just going to raise costs even more.
Yeah, and there was this editorial in the Daily News yesterday. I generally agree with their editorials, but this one I didn't. That said, well, New Jersey Transit, it's underfunded and they need a revenue stream, just like New York transit system has a revenue stream, and it's on New Jersey to approve some kind of tax to fund the transit system. But these are two separate issues. First of all, the governor did approve a corporate tax surcharge last year to try to get New Jersey Transit on an even footing. That's fine, but there's a difference between one tax revenue stream and 12 tax revenue streams. And we've seen on the New York side, we started off in the early 80s. Okay, the transit system has been neglected. Let's implement some taxes here to get it on an even financial footing. But the union agreements always manage to outrun these tax revenues. So every couple of years, you need a new tax revenue, even though all these existing tax revenues keep up with inflation, they keep up with job growth, they keep up with economic growth. So theoretically, once you've got your core taxes there to fund transit, you should never need another one. That hasn't been the case. Governor Hochul in New York just increased the payroll tax on downstate jobs for the MTA. So for people to say, oh, New Jersey Transit, they need to fund the system better, that's an entirely separate issue from do they want to go down the road or the rail of New York style contracts. And the other issue with regards to that is New Jersey is just not as dependent as New York is on transit. Like, that's just the reality. And so could they have withstood a longer strike? There are other ways to get into New York. There's the PATH train, there's bus service. More people take bus than New Jersey Transit rail into New York City. And of course, within New Jersey, where a lot of New Jersey Transit riders just stay within the state, a lot of people just drive. You could set up a carpool system, you could offer extra van service. Would it be possible to get through a long strike without devastating the economy? Probably.
I think people are overlooking another driver here, and that's that Princeton Reunions is coming up, and alumni nationwide descending on the Garden State. There were concerns in various listservs that I've been involved in. I think that exacerbated
general
things.
government, right? Like the tri-state areas has a lot of influential people who want to get to New Jersey. I wanna take us out, so I'm gonna ask everyone as usual, do a little prediction of the future. I feel like we've touched on this already, but do we expect this based upon the incentives that were introduced by the deal? I mean, we don't know the full terms yet, but do we expect there to be more transit strikes of this nature over the next several years? John, what's your prediction?
So I think we're going to see more copycat activity. And, even if we don't, we're going to see some of the other New Jersey unions potentially getting the benefit of this Brotherhood deal because of what's known as Me Too provisions. If you have similarly situated contracts and one union gets a better deal than another, well, the Me Too provision kicks in and gives the benefit to the other. So, no matter what, I see higher cost pressures here, and that's going to be bad for public finances.
Nicole, what's your gut instinct? Are we going to see more of this? The
Yeah,
thought.
I think, to the extent, again, we don't know the details of the agreement, but if it turns out that they are rewarded for the strike and that the governor was just terrified of the idea of coming back to the Tuesday, more people on the trains who need some way of getting to work and not wanting the bad press, and Murphy's thinking, this is my last year in office, I just don't want to deal with this, and that he just backed down, then yes, I think it does give the New York unions and other unions in New Jersey more incentive to strike. And it's the end of a trend and the potential beginning of another one that for the past 15 years, since the 2008 financial crisis, I guess that's 17 years now, both the Republicans and the Democrats in New Jersey have been a little less friendly to public sector labor. Both former Governor Christie and to some extent even Murphy, with some of the health care benefits, have been less reluctant to give away the store to the unions. Murphy has been making the full pension payments, which takes away from other resources you could give in just straight pay. So they've kind of held the line on increasing public sector pay and benefits. And does this start the opposite trend? Who knows, but it's certainly a risk.
Ilya, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm in my suburban abode. I just drive around everywhere. I try to avoid the metro when I can.
Fair.
Good leadership is Ed Koch walking across the Brooklyn Bridge saying, we're going to work and we're going to stick it to these guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing to watch is what does the next governor of New Jersey say, and that's a hot race right now. And are they all going to capitulate? My guess is yes. It's unfortunate. All right, I wanna turn us to our other news, a little underattended, but very much on the City Journal. Well, the City Journal Domestic Terrorism beat, really, which is a major focus of ours. So over the weekend, 25-year-old Guy Bartkus detonated a car bomb near a fertility clinic in Palm Springs, Florida, leaving himself dead and four injured. In a manifesto released online after the fact, Bartkus indicated he did it because he was an antinatalist who believed that being born is a fundamental injustice. So I find this story sort of interesting
He
in
apparently
part.
had a gripe against his parents for
Yes,
allowing him to be born without his consent or
the
something like
great
that.
injustice being born without his consent. This is part of a broader stream of philosophy. It's sort of a very online way of thinking about things, which I find very interesting. Part of why I wanted to talk about this story is, this is a guy who was clearly sort of radicalized by this sort of particular online ultra utilitarianism that says pleasure is only sometimes good, pain is always bad, therefore in toto all lives are bad, therefore life is intrinsically not justifiable and we should end it as quickly as possible. So I'm curious for the group's takes, like what do we make of this broader trend of, think about Luigi Mangione, for example, this broader trend of online radicalization? Is this part of that? Is there a coherent story there?
I mean, it's very nihilistic. It's the definition of nihilism. Everything's bad, and the best thing to do is nothingness, and embrace the void. It's dark, and certainly the kind of online digital mechanisms accentuate whatever instincts or dynamics that one might have. It's kind of a spiraling echo chamber, if you will, to mix metaphors.
Have these people never experienced some benefit or some positive outcome through adversity and suffering? I mean, it seems to me that everyone from, the child touching the hot stove to someone who maybe failed at a task or a test of some sort and then did better and wound up stronger because of it would recognize experientially that the premise of antinatalism, that pain is always bad, just doesn't hold. I mean, just logically too, it's irrational. I mean, if You have to exist in order to conceive of the idea that non-existence is better than existence. I mean,
Ontological proof.
existence is a prerequisite for
It's
everything.
kind of like I don't know if it's the opposite or the same thing as the philosophical tenet that murder has no victim because the victim doesn't exist, and it's a very strange way of thinking. And I may get my Russian nihilists mixed up, but didn't Dostoevsky say it would be better not to have been born at all? So just a very strange way of thinking. And I just think it's weird that you can get radicalized into like your own thing that nobody else cares about. I mean, there's so many things that people get radicalized about, and there's a large group of people, but you can also just get focused on your own one strange thing and not even need a group of people supporting you, which is also very
You know,
strange and
when
probably
I
not
first heard
relevant.
about this, I thought it might have been somebody who was really against IVF. The moral argument
Right.
about killing embryos or something. But no, apparently just against all life. I mean, you know, is this a big thing online? I clearly am not hanging out in these darkest corners of the dark web, what have you. But this is just bizarre.
I think there's been a really interesting pattern, and this goes to Nicole's point and Ilya's point of sort of bespoke ideological radicalization. There's this story. There's Luigi Mangione, the guy who shot and killed Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO. There was I think an attempted school shooter a few months ago who was just sort of hanging out in like far right racist nihilist spaces, and she was motivated by this for sort of incoherent, indiscernible reasons. There was a cult of radical anarchist vegans, the Zizians, who like shot and killed several people. They killed a border patrol agent, I believe. And I've been thinking about Ross Douthat had a book a few years ago called The Decadent Society, which touched on a number of themes. One of his arguments was that the internet has been sort of a suppressant of this like radical terror, that we're spending all of our time on our phones, and that becomes the outlet for our sort of most destructive impulses. And that seemed true at the time, and it seems less and less true, that there are all of these sort of like bespoke individualized terrorisms that have cropped up over the past 5, 6 months, that suggests that there is something weirder going on there.
Well, Charles, you're right that there are smaller groups that have had critical masses emerge through the internet to sustain continued conversation, but I do think that there are more mainstream contributors here. So the idea that human beings are responsible for so many of the world's ills feeds into this kind of philosophy. Environmental advocacy, for example, used to be predicated on the idea of preserving a beautiful and healthy world for posterity's sake. Right now, it's largely about blaming humanity for things like climate change, right? And that's a troubling turn because it downplays human well-being as a defensible and desirable goal of our actions. And I think that's troubling, and it's feeding into all of this.
I think that's very plausible, right? I think you see this sort of as an undercurrent in all of those stories, the sense of like that there is, there's no intrinsic meaning, that like humans are harmful, and then B, the thing that you do in order to have some impact in the world is sort of like a bold political gesture, and often sort of nihilistic or destructive political gesture. That you think about. Trying to get a less recent example, but there are a couple of high-profile shootings that seem to have been motivated by this sort of like nihilistic desire for historical relevance. So I think this gets to much deeper themes of like this returns to the antinatalism, and this is John's point. Like, if you aren't situated in like family structure, if you aren't situated in sort of a continual process, if you're just sort of an isolated individual, this stuff starts to make sense. And the internet is a consistency enforcing machine, right? Like what the internet often mandates that people do is sort of come up with the most radical versions of their beliefs. And so I think it makes sense that you're starting to see this cascade.
Yeah. Well, the Las Vegas bombing on around Trump's inauguration. I mean, another thing is it's just people can just figure out how to build a bomb very easily. And that also, like, you used to be able to buy like the anarchist cookbook or whatever, but it took some more work, and the barrier to entry to doing this is lower, which is also not very good.
We ran a piece at CJ a few weeks back that I really liked and I think didn't get enough attention. So listeners, go read it. About exactly this problem. The three authors, Canadian academics, the lead author was a criminologist, Laura Huey, and their argument was that technological innovation and AI in particular is making the work of policing and managing domestic terrorism much, much harder because you are lowering exactly those thresholds. And the way I like to think about it is like the human capital costs of getting into domestic terrorism, the opportunity cost is pretty high. That's why you don't get a lot of domestic terrorists, because like anyone who's good enough to be an effective domestic terrorist can probably do something else. But if you lower the barriers to entry into the field of domestic terrorism, you will get more people doing it because they can like jailbreak ChatGPT and have a productive conversation about how to commit a terror attack.
So the answer to that is more proactivity. And this individual, Bartkus, was a disturbed young man. I mean, he set his family's house on fire. He went through a very bitter divorce through his parents, and so the warning signs were there. So I think a greater proactivity and prevention is going to be critical in addressing the problems that you just laid out, Charles.
All right, I wanna take us out. So I wanna, yet again, we're gonna ask for a little bit of prediction, but I think we've seen this pattern over the past, I will start, we've seen this pattern over the past 6 months to a year where after honestly a multi-decade lull in domestic terrorism, those numbers have been steadily creeping up. And that's a very those numbers often get co-opted sort of by a partisan narrative on both sides. But I'm curious if people think, are we, I think back to the 1970s, there was this period of extraordinarily high terrorism in the United States, hundreds of bombings every year. We sort of entered into this lull. Are we returning to a higher equilibrium level of terrorism and civil disorder? Is it like sort of a guaranteed part of the historical cycle, or is this just sort of a blip? As
Well, we're
always,
at a time of low societal trust and anomie of various kinds, and it's kind of a, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's a weird period. And when there are weird periods, that's a social scientific term, we get this kind of disorder of various kinds. So some of it is tied to politics, some of it is tied to kind of cultural shifts of various kinds. But yeah, it's not a pleasant thing to think about.
John, what's your prediction? What's your take on it?
We don't give our young people hope in a better future and an attainable future. And when we don't convince them of the goodness of our civilization, I think we're going to have problems like this. And the social media effect is just going to amplify it. As you alluded to, Charles, there were attempts on Queen Victoria's life for similar morbid reasons. Now, I think you will see that kind of effect amplified because social media is increasingly becoming the barometer of success. Right? Like how many Gen Zers and alphas want to become influencers, right? And that could take a rather distressing turn for the worse. And as Ilya said, yeah, it's partially political too. There's this perception that our political system can't handle our big issues, right? And so you need to take matters into your own hands, a la Luigi Mangione, right? And this hagiography that's just been created around him will feed narratives that I fear and hope not, but I fear that will lead to more of these types of incidents.
Nicole, what's your prediction? What do you think?
I always wonder, and I never know which side is to come down on. I go back and forth. Is how much this is similar or different to the 9/11 era Islamist attacks. Where people argued this is a one issue action. Like even like Osama bin Laden was mad about U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia and all this stuff, and this is specifically to do with issues related to Islam. as it was interpreted, or was it just the same nihilistic young men where it was also the same economic demographics where these were never poor people, these were never the people who were worst off, and if you followed that philosophy, the most likely to engage in suicide bombing or other nihilistic actions. But these were people who had education and had other opportunity, and they, in some cases, made it to the West, and they still chose to do this. How much is that the same as Luigi Mangione and other instances that we're seeing, and how much is it different?
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing about 9/11 is that it's almost the outlier, or that Islamic radical terrorism was always the outlier in that relatively benign period. Otherwise, I think that's part of why it was so shocking. I mean, I guess the way I think about this is I wrote a piece for the Free Press a month or so ago, 2 months ago, the thesis of which was basically, political terrorism happens, political violence happens because we let it. That you see this sort of permission structure that authorizes it, and then once that happens, it becomes easier to do, and so you get more of it, and so we have less will to deter it, and so it gets harder and harder, and you get this runaway effect. And we saw what happened with this in the 1970s, and I'm concerned that we're at the start of this cycle again. To John's point, this is why prevention matters, and this is why sort of cultural messaging matters. If you
Maybe
have
that means
leaders,
we'll get some good movies out of Hollywood again.
maybe. No, but if you have leaders who are like, actually, Luigi Mangione has a good point. If you have Elizabeth Warren and AOC saying that, there are going to be more of them. It's not a huge surprise.
I wonder if Barkus could have bought a house at 20 by 25, would he have been so
Yeah,
frustrated?
I think that's right. All right. On that very cheery note, let's talk about happier news to New Yorkers. Everyone on this Monday is in New York is still cheering following the Knicks' stunning Game 6 win over the Celtics on Friday. New Yorkers, are you following along with the Knicks? If not, what sports are you
Charles, I
following
must say this is
in New York?
triggering and really a micro, if not a macro aggression, because of course last night my Toronto Maple Leafs lost yet another Game 7, 7 in a row at this point, or 8 in a row, I think, Game 7s, going back, more than 2 decades. The last time they were in the conference finals was 2002, similar to the Knicks, and it's just very painful. It's
We're standing in solidarity with you, Ilya. We're allies to your Canadian identity. It's valid.
No, I prefer my Maple Leafs blue, not red. This has nothing to do with Canada. It's just the vestigial home team. And I tell you what, I'm also a Caps fan, of course, because we've discussed this. I'm a sports bigamist, and the Caps also went out a couple of days ago. In fact, of the last 8 games by those two teams, only one win. So that's been my last 10 days, Charles.
Nicole, John, do you have happier news on the sports front?
I understand when it comes to things like the Knicks, like how people can go through life like not knowing who the vice president is, because I just entirely skip those pages of the newspaper. So I would have no idea, name even one player on either team. I couldn't do it. But I did watch the Subway Series where the Yankees took 2 games and the Mets only one, so that's not very good. We'll see if the Mets maintain their position as we go into the summer.
Interesting. Okay, Mets fan, got it.
And
Uh,
so I'm not really a sports follower, but part of the reason is I love New York so much already that if I were a Yankees fan, I would just be completely intolerable. So like it's just too much. But my loyalties are based on my proximity. So I am a Mets fan because Citi Field, I still call it Shea Stadium, is about a 10-minute drive from me, and so I have my affection to home, like everything else. And baseball for me, it has this sort of magic that there's no time limit. It could just keep stretching out into the night. Football is just so visceral, so violent, and it's more, I think, tied up with pop culture. I'm like, I don't care about Kelsey and the Swift. I don't care about the Super Bowl halftime. Just take me out to the ball game. Uh, America's great pastime.
so what I've taken away from this is that we need to do an MI poll and see how many people are Yankees fans and how many people are Mets fans, because that could be a dividing issue within the Greater Manhattan Institute sphere. All right. On that note, that's about all the time that we have. Thank you to our panelists. Everyone should go buy Nicole's book and also Ilya's book. Just buy all the books, really. Thank you, as always, to our producer, Isabella Reggi. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, or even if you haven't, please like, subscribe, ring the bell for more. Don't forget to leave us comments on YouTube or anywhere else you can leave us comments, questions. We might even answer some at some point. Until next time, you've been listening to the City Journal podcast. Hope you'll join us.